That looks like Orion.
They said Michelle Ramirez was unreachable. Locked behind invisible walls, the billionaire's daughter sat at the finest tables in Texas, surrounded by crystal and silver, yet utterly alone. Her father, Lawrence Ramirez, could buy anything in the world except the one thing that mattered, a way to reach his little girl. For 2 years, Michelle hadn't spoken a single word. The parade of specialists had tried everything: behavioral therapy, sensory integration, social skills training. They'd subjected her to assessments and interventions that cost more than most people earned in a year. Each expert delivered the same verdict with clinical detachment: she's making minimal progress. Perhaps you should adjust your expectations, Mr. Ramirez. But Lawrence couldn't adjust. Every morning, he watched his daughter drift further away, her blue eyes distant and unfocused, her small hands flapping in patterns only she understood. The guilt ate at him. Had his obsession with building his empire stolen the years when he might have made a difference? His wife had left them both 3 years ago, unable to cope with Michelle's diagnosis. Now it was just the two of them in a mansion that echoed with silence. Then one sweltering July afternoon at the Pinnacle Club, everything changed. Joshua Parkman, a lanky 15-year-old kid with warm brown skin and cautious eyes, cleared their table. He wore the club's pale blue uniform that hung slightly loose on his thin frame, and he moved with the careful invisibility of someone who'd learned that drawing attention meant trouble. But Joshua did something no one else had done in 2 years. He saw Michelle, really saw her, and what happened next would shatter every assumption about who has value, who has wisdom, and where miracles come from. Lawrence Ramirez stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office on the 42nd floor, watching the Houston skyline blur in the afternoon heat. Behind him, 6 executives waited in silence, their presentations abandoned mid-pitch. He was on the phone, voice sharp and controlled, closing a deal that would add another $50 million to Ramirez Technologies' quarterly revenue. Tell Kaufman he has until 5 o'clock, not 5:01. 5. He ended the call and turned back to the room, silver-threaded hair catching the light, his tailored Tom Ford suit fitting him like armor. Continue. The presentation resumed. Lawrence listened with half his attention, nodding at the right moments, asking pointed questions that made grown men nervous. This was his element: the clean geometry of profit and loss, problems that could be solved with enough capital and strategic thinking. Here, he was in control. Here, everything made sense. But there was an exhaustion around his eyes that expensive suits couldn't hide, a tension in his shoulders that had nothing to do with corporate warfare. When his assistant slipped him a note reminding him of his 5:30 hard stop, relief flickered across his face before the mask returned. The River Oaks mansion was only 12 minutes from downtown, but it might as well have been a different planet. Lawrence's Bentley glided through gates that closed behind him with a soft click of security engaging. The house sprawled across manicured grounds: 6 bedrooms, 8 bathrooms, a pool no one used, and enough square footage to house 3 families comfortably. Art hung on every wall, selected by a consultant he'd never met. Everything was beautiful. Everything was silent. He found Michelle at the kitchen island, a slab of Italian marble that had cost more than most cars. She was working through a math worksheet while Mrs. Chun sat beside her, tablet in hand, documenting. Mrs. Chun was a kind woman, clinical in the way of people trained to observe and record rather than simply be. She'd been Michelle's aide for 8 months, the longest any had lasted. How was her day? Lawrence asked from the doorway. Mrs. Chun glanced up, her smile professional. 3 episodes of self-soothing behavior during transitions. Minimal verbal output. She completed her assignments, but required frequent redirection. I've logged everything in the system. Michelle didn't look up. Her small hands moved across the paper, pencil gripped in an awkward fist. She was humming something tuneless, a sound that had once charmed Lawrence and now just reminded him of all the silences that followed. Michelle? He tried. Hey, sweetie. Daddy's home. Nothing. Not even a pause in the humming. Lawrence loosened his tie, feeling something heavy settle in his chest. Thank you, Mrs. Chun. I'll take it from here. After the aide left, Lawrence sat across from his daughter. Michelle was 10 years old, blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail, delicate features that reminded him painfully of her mother. She wore a lavender dress she'd picked out herself. Michelle had strong opinions about textures and colors, even if she couldn't always voice them. Her blue eyes remained fixed on her work, tracing patterns only she could see. "I love you," Lawrence said quietly, to the top of her head. Michelle's hand flapped once, twice, then returned to the pencil. Lawrence sat there for 5 more minutes, watching his daughter exist in a world he couldn't enter, before retreating to his study to return emails and pretend his heart wasn't breaking. Across the city, in an apartment building where the elevator worked only sometimes and the hallway smelled of cooking and industrial cleaner, Joshua Parkman was already in his uniform. The pale blue polo hung loose on his thin frame. They'd given him a medium, but he was all sharp angles and long limbs, still waiting for the rest of him to catch up to his height. "You got your bus fare?" Vera Parkman emerged from her bedroom, already dressed in her nursing scrubs. She was 68, but moved like someone older, her joints stiff from years of hard work and harder losses. Still, her eyes were sharp with love and worry. "Yes, ma'am." Joshua held up the card he'd loaded that morning. "And you'll be back by when?" "Shift ends at 9. I'll be home by 10:30, maybe 11, depending on the buses." Vera's mouth tightened, but she didn't argue. They needed the money. Joshua's summer job at the Pinnacle Club paid $12 an hour minimum wage, but it was steady, and Marcus Webb had promised him good hours if he kept his head down and worked hard. The apartment was small but fiercely clean, everything in its place because there wasn't room for mess. Family photos lined one wall, Joshua's school pictures showing the same serious expression year after year, his grandmother's wedding photo from 50 years ago, and his mother, Patricia Parkman, dead at 42 from diabetes. She'd gone to the emergency room for too late because she didn't have insurance and couldn't afford to miss work. She smiled out from the frame, young and hopeful, unaware of how the story would end. "Take care of yourself, baby," Vera said, pulling him into a hug that smelled like cocoa butter and determination. "And remember, keep my eyes down, my mouth shut, and don't give nobody reason to notice me." "I know, Grandma. That's my smart boy." She kissed his forehead. "Though you're too smart for your own good sometimes. The world don't always reward smart when it comes in your particular package." Joshua knew what she meant. He'd been learning that lesson since he was old enough to walk into a store and watch security guards track his movement. The bus ride to the Pinnacle Club took him through every economic gradient Houston had to offer. From Fifth Ward's worn houses and corner stores to Midtown's gentrifying blocks to the museum district's clean sidewalks and finally to River Oaks, where the streets had names like Lazy Lane and the lawns looked painted on. Joshua watched it all through the window, invisible to the other passengers, just another black teenager in a uniform heading to serve people who'd never learn his name. Marcus Webb was waiting when Joshua arrived at the staff entrance. Marcus was 50, his hair more gray than black now, his posture military straight. He'd worked at the Pinnacle for 28 years, starting as a dishwasher and working up to head of service, a position he'd earned through perfection and the careful navigation of boundaries that could get a man fired or worse. "You're early. That's good." Marcus looked Joshua up and down, adjusting the collar of his polo. "Tuck your shirt in tighter. Keep your name tag straight. And listen carefully, because I'm only saying this once." They walked through the service corridors, white walls and fluorescent lights, the backstage of luxury. Marcus spoke without looking at him. "Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am. Always. Keep your eyes down unless directly addressed. Clear tables efficiently, but not so fast you draw attention. We are here to be useful and invisible. You understand the difference?" "Yes, sir. I don't think you do yet, but you will." Marcus stopped outside the dining room doors. Through the small windows, Joshua could see the crystalline world beyond white tablecloths, fresh flowers, people in clothes that cost more than Joshua's entire wardrobe. "These people, they don't see us." "Not really. And that's fine. That's actually safer. The moment you forget that, the moment you step outside your role, you're out. And you take me down with you, because I've vouched for you. Do you understand?" Joshua understood. He'd been training for invisibility his whole life. The dining room was beautiful in that effortless way of serious money, crystal chandeliers throwing soft light, windows overlooking gardens that required 3 full-time groundskeepers. A string quartet played something classical in the corner. Conversations murmured like water over stone. Marcus pointed to a section near the windows. "Table 7. Lawrence Ramirez, he's on the board. His daughter will be with him. She has challenges. Don't stare. Don't engage. Clear and move on." Table 7 was the best table in the room, positioned to catch the evening light. Joshua approached with his training running through his head, silent, efficient, invisible. Lawrence Ramirez sat with his phone pressed to his ear, speaking in clipped tones about market positions and shareholder expectations. His suit probably cost more than Joshua's grandmother made in a month. Beside him sat a little girl in a lavender dress. Michelle. She was humming tunelessly, her small hands systematically tearing her napkin into precise strips. Her movements were deliberate, creating a pattern on the white tablecloth. She didn't look at her father, didn't seem to register anything beyond her task. Joshua began clearing the bread plates, methodical and quiet. He'd learned to move through spaces without disturbing them, a skill honed in a world that preferred him unnoticed. Then Michelle's hand caught her water glass. It toppled in what felt like slow motion, crystal crashing against china, water spreading across the table in a clear tide. Lawrence's conversation stopped mid-sentence. Nearby diners glanced over with that particular expression of discomfort people wear when confronted with a scene. Michelle's humming pitched higher, becoming a whine. She started rocking, hands flapping frantically. "It's okay, sweetie," Lawrence said, but his voice was tight with embarrassment and exhaustion that went bone deep. "It's just water. It's fine." But Michelle's rocking intensified. The whine grew louder. Joshua moved without thinking, grabbing his service cloth and efficiently blotting the water. His hands worked quickly, clearing the wet items, soaking up the spill. And as he worked, he noticed something. The napkin strips Michelle had created weren't random. They formed a pattern, a specific constellation of white against white. 3 stars in a diagonal line, for more forming a rough rectangle around them. Without thinking, without remembering Marcus's warnings or his grandmother's advice or any of the rules that kept people like him safe, Joshua spoke quietly. "That looks like Orion." The whining stopped. Michelle's humming cut off mid-note. For just a moment, maybe 2 seconds, maybe less, her blue eyes flicked to Joshua's face. Really looked at him. Saw him. Then her gaze skittered away, back to the ruined pattern on the wet tablecloth. But Joshua had seen it. Connection. Recognition. A flicker of something that said, "You see what I see." Lawrence noticed too. His attention shifted from his phone to Joshua. Really looked at him for the first time. Not through him, the way most wealthy people looked at service staff. At him. Joshua felt the weight of that gaze, the assessment happening behind those exhausted eyes. "Thank you," Lawrence said finally. "That's all." It was a dismissal. Joshua nodded and retreated, pulse hammering. He'd broken the rules. He'd spoken directly to a member's child without being addressed. He'd overstepped. Marcus would be furious. But as Joshua cleared the next table, keeping his head down and his movements efficient, he couldn't stop thinking about those 2 seconds. About a little girl who tore napkins into constellations. About the way her eyes had found his, just for a moment, before the world closed back in. That night, lying in his narrow bed with his grandmother's oxygen machine humming in the next room, Joshua stared at the water-stained ceiling and thought about isolation. About being in rooms full of people who looked right through you. About the particular loneliness of living in a world that had decided you didn't matter. He thought about Michelle Ramirez, sitting in the best restaurant in Houston, wearing a dress that probably cost more than his rent, living in a mansion he couldn't imagine. And he recognized something in her that he'd seen in his own mirror every day of his life. She was invisible too. Different reasons, different kind of invisible, but alone in the exact same way. Joshua pulled his thin blanket higher and made a decision he didn't quite understand yet. Tomorrow, when he cleared table 7, he would look for more constellations. Because maybe, just maybe, someone had to see her. And maybe that someone was allowed to be him. Joshua had never spent time in the public library before, not really. He'd gone for school assignments, in and out. But on his day off, he found himself at the Heights branch with its worn carpet and flickering fluorescent lights, claiming a computer terminal in the back corner where nobody would bother him. He typed autism into the search bar and hesitated. Then he added actually autistic because something told him he needed to hear from people who lived it, not people who studied it. The results flooded his screen. Blogs, forums, Twitter threads, YouTube videos. He started reading and couldn't stop. A woman in her 30s wrote, "I spent 20 years in therapy learning to make eye contact, to stop stimmying, to act normal. Nobody asked if normal was what I needed. They just assumed being like them was better than being like me." A teenage boy posted, "We're not broken. We don't need to be fixed. We need to be understood. We're speaking, you're just not listening in the right language. Joshua sat back, something clicking into place in his chest. He'd spent his whole life in a world that looked at him and saw threat, criminality, or nothing at all. People crossed the street when he approached. Store security followed him through aisles. Teachers assumed he was the problem before asking questions. He wasn't dangerous or criminal, but the world had decided what his black skin meant before he ever opened his mouth. What if Michelle was experiencing the same kind of not being seen? Not because of her skin, but because her brain worked differently. What if everyone was so busy trying to fix her, to make her normal, that nobody had bothered to learn her language first? He read for 3 hours, taking notes on the back of a receipt. Sensory sensitivities, communication differences, the exhaustion of masking, the pain of being treated like a puzzle to solve instead of a person to know. When he finally left, the Houston heat hit him like a wall, but Joshua barely noticed. His mind was racing with possibilities. Over the next week, Joshua watched Michelle with new eyes. He didn't stare. Marcus would have his head, but he observed in the quiet moments while clearing tables, while refilling water glasses, while being invisible in the way the Pinnacle Club required. He noticed she covered her ears when the string quartet played, her face scrunching in distress. But when the pianist took over during their break, Michelle's hands relaxed. She even swayed slightly, some internal rhythm matching the simpler melody. He noticed she organized her food by color before eating. Greens together, then whites, then browns. Lawrence would sometimes try to interrupt the pattern, offering her a bite of something, but Michelle would pull back, agitated, until the organization was complete. He noticed her fixation on light and reflections. The way she positioned her water glass to catch the chandelier's glow, creating small rainbows on the tablecloth. How she'd tilt her head to watch the patterns shift and dance. And he noticed her stymiing the hand flapping. The rocking was most intense when Lawrence was on his phone, when the restaurant was crowded and loud. But on quieter evenings, when her father put his phone away and the ambient noise dropped, Michelle's movements gentled. She was still there, still present in her body, but calmer. Joshua started small experiments. When clearing their table, he'd arrange the remaining items in a patterned salt shaker, pepper grinder, sugar caddy in a triangle. The first time, Michelle stared at it for a full minute after he walked away. The second time, she rearranged them. Into a line. A different pattern, but deliberate. Joshua's heart hammered. It was communication. Silent, unconventional, but real. The third time, he left 3 spoons in a row. Michelle added a fourth, completing something Joshua didn't quite understand, but recognized as intentional. They were talking. Marcus caught him after the Thursday dinner shift, pulling him into the staff corridor with a grip that wasn't quite rough, but wasn't gentle either. "I see what you're doing," Marcus said, his voice low and hard. "Stop." Joshua's stomach dropped. "Sir, I know what you're You're getting attached to that little girl. You think you're helping." Marcus's expression was a complicated mix of frustration and something that looked like concern. "That little girl has problems we can't solve, Joshua. Her father has hired people with degrees longer than your arm. Specialists who've spent their whole careers on this. You think you're going to swoop in and fix her? I'm not trying to fix her. Then what are you trying to do? Because from where I'm standing, you're going to get attached, you're going to step over a line, and you're going to get us both fired. Stay in your lane." Joshua wanted to argue, wanted to explain about the patterns, the language, the connection he could feel building like something fragile and vital. But Marcus's face was set, and Joshua had learned when to push and when to survive. "Yes, sir," he said quietly. Marcus studied him for a long moment. "You're a good kid, Joshua. But good don't pay the bills, and it don't protect you when things go wrong. Remember that." Joshua nodded. But he didn't stop. Lawrence Ramirez had noticed the silent interactions, and he didn't know what to make of them. Part of him wanted to intervene. This was his daughter, his struggle, his responsibility. Who was this teenage busboy to presume he could help where countless professionals had failed? But another part of him, the part that had watched Michelle retreat further into herself each month despite every intervention and therapy and expensive program, was curious, desperate even. So Lawrence did something he rarely did in any area of his life. He observed instead of directing. And what he saw surprised him. Michelle, who flinched from Mrs. Chin's well-meaning touch, allowed Joshua to stand near her, closer than anyone else could get without triggering her withdrawal. Michelle, who barely seemed to register the existence of other people, watched for Joshua when they arrived at the club. Her gaze would track him across the room, following his movements between tables. One evening, Lawrence noticed Michelle had saved a napkin, folded it carefully instead of tearing it into her usual patterns. When Joshua came to clear their table, she pushed it toward him. Joshua unfolded it. Inside was a drawing, simple lines that might have been stars, or might have been something else entirely. But Joshua smiled like he understood, and Michelle's hands flapped in what Lawrence had learned was her expression of excitement. "Thank you," Joshua said quietly. "I'll keep it safe." Michelle's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but closer than Lawrence had seen in months. That night, Lawrence sat in his study with a glass of scotch he didn't drink, thinking about patterns and languages and the terrible possibility that he'd been approaching his daughter's autism like a business problem, something to be solved, managed, optimized, when maybe what she needed was someone who would just see her. 3 weeks into his job, Joshua did something that terrified him. He waited by the parking lot after Lawrence's dinner, hands shaking, rehearsing words in his head that kept rearranging themselves into inadequacy. When Lawrence emerged, Joshua stepped forward before he could lose his nerve. "Mr. Ramirez? Sir? Could I talk to you for just a moment?" Lawrence stopped, surprise crossing his face. Up close, Joshua could see the exhaustion that expensive suits couldn't hide, the weight the man carried in the set of his shoulders. "Yes?" Joshua's mouth went dry. Every survival instinct screamed at him to back down, apologize for the interruption, return to invisibility. But he thought about Michelle's drawings, about the patterns they'd been building, about a little girl who had things to say if anyone would listen in the right language. "It's about Michelle, sir. I don't mean to overstep, but I was wondering, has she ever tried an AAC device? It's like pictures and words she could point to instead of speaking. I read that sometimes autistic kids have things to say, they just can't make their mouths do it." Lawrence's expression was unreadable. The silence stretched long enough that Joshua's heart started hammering against his ribs. "Then, we tried that 2 years ago. She wouldn't engage with it." Maybe Joshua forced himself to continue. Maybe she would now? If she picked the images herself? If it was about things she actually wants to talk about instead of things we think she should? Something shifted in Lawrence's face. "You've been researching autism." It wasn't a question, but Joshua answered anyway. "Yes, sir. I wanted to understand." "Why?" The question came out sharp, almost desperate. "Why do you care?" Joshua didn't have a smooth answer. He'd never been good at smooth. Just truth. "Because I see her, sir. And I think she sees me too. And maybe that matters." Lawrence was silent for so long Joshua thought he'd ruined everything. Then the man's shoulders dropped, just slightly, the corporate armor cracking. "I'll think about it," Lawrence said finally. Then, quieter, "Thank you for caring about my daughter." 2 days later, Lawrence brought an iPad to dinner. Joshua watched from across the room as the man pulled it out, showing Michelle the screen filled with colorful icons and images. Michelle ignored it, her attention fixed on the chandelier's light reflecting through her water glass, creating small dancing rainbows. Lawrence's shoulders slumped. He set the device aside. But when Joshua came to clear their table, he quietly pointed to the iPad, then to a picture of a star. Michelle's eyes followed the movement. She looked at the screen, then at Joshua, then back at the screen. She reached out, one small finger extended, and pressed the star icon. "Star," the device said in its robotic voice. Joshua smiled. "Yeah, star." Michelle pressed it again, and again. Each time the electronic voice repeated, "Star, star, star." Then she looked at Joshua, and the corner of her mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but something close, something real. She pressed a different icon. More. Another. Light. Another. See. Her hands flapped, that expression of excitement Joshua had learned to recognize. She was speaking. In her way, in her language, she was finally speaking. Lawrence sat frozen in his chair, watching his daughter engage with the device she'd refused for 2 years. When Joshua glanced at him, the man had tears running silently down his face. Michelle pressed another icon. This time, she looked directly at her father while the device spoke. "Happy," it said. Lawrence's breath caught. "You're happy, sweetheart?" Michelle's finger moved again. "Yes." Joshua stepped back, giving them space, returning to his role of invisible efficiency. But his own eyes were burning, and his hands trembled as he cleared the next table. Marcus found him in the kitchen 20 minutes later. "What did you do?" Marcus asked, but his voice wasn't angry. It was odd. I listened, Joshua said. In a different language. Marcus shook his head slowly. That little girl hasn't communicated like that in years. Lawrence just cornered me asking about you. Your background, your schedule, everything. Joshua's stomach clenched. Am I in trouble? Trouble? Marcus laughed, but it was a strange sound. Boy, I don't know what you are. But you just did something I've watched trained professionals fail at for 2 years. So either you're the luckiest person alive, or you've got something the rest of us missed. That night, riding the bus home through Houston's shifting neighborhoods, Joshua thought about languages. About how many ways people could speak without ever opening their mouths. About how easily the world dismissed voices that didn't sound like what it expected. He thought about Michelle's almost smile, about the word happy coming from that device, about Lawrence Ramirez crying in the middle of the Pinnacle Club's dining room. And he thought about his mother, who died because nobody listened when she said something was wrong. About his father, convicted because a jury saw a black man and assumed guilt. About his grandmother, working herself to exhaustion because the world had decided her labor was worth $12 an hour and not a penny more. All of them speaking. All of them ignored. Maybe that was his superpower, Joshua thought as the bus carried him back to Fifth Ward. Not that he could fix things or solve problems, but that he'd learned to listen in languages the world didn't value. Maybe being invisible had taught him to see the invisible. And maybe, just maybe, that mattered more than all the degrees and expertise and expensive interventions money could buy. By mid-July, the Texas heat had settled over Houston like a wet blanket. But inside the Pinnacle Club's climate-controlled dining room, Michelle Ramirez was speaking. Not with her voice that still came only rarely, in single words that seemed to cost her everything, but with her device. The iPad had become an extension of her, always within reach, and she used it most with Joshua. Water, she'd press when he cleared their table, and he'd refill her glass. More, when she wanted him to continue a story about constellations. Stop, when the sensory input became too much and she needed him to step back. Go, pointing toward the windows when she wanted to show him something, a cloud formation, the way light hit the garden. She brought him books now, waited for his breaks, and presented them solemnly, volumes about space, fractals, mathematical patterns. Joshua would flip through them while she watched, her hands flapping when he paused on a page she particularly loved. One evening, during a lull in service, Michelle pulled him to the tall windows overlooking the club's grounds. She pointed upward, using her device to say, "Look." The clouds were doing something unusual, breaking apart and reforming in patterns that caught the setting sun. "Beautiful," Joshua said. Michelle pressed buttons rapidly. "Beautiful. Yes. Change. Pattern. See. I see," Joshua said, and meant it. Mrs. Chun watched these interactions with bafflement that bordered on professional offense. "I don't understand," she confessed to Lawrence. "We've been working on device communication for months. She barely used it with me. But with that boy." Lawrence had no answer. He was caught between hope fierce and painful, and something that felt uncomfortably like jealousy. This was his daughter. His struggle. His 2 years of watching her slip away despite everything he could afford, everything he could buy, every expert he could hire. And a 15-year-old busboy had reached her in weeks. The invitation came on a Thursday evening, after another successful interaction where Michelle had used her device to tell Joshua about a documentary on stars she'd watched. Lawrence approached as Joshua was clearing the last of the dishes. "Could I speak with you? Privately?" They stepped into the hallway, away from the dining room's murmur. Lawrence looked uncomfortable, a rare expression on a man used to controlling every situation. "I'd like to invite you to our home. On your day off, if you're willing. To spend time with Michelle in a more comfortable environment." He paused. "I'll pay you, of course. Your hourly rate, plus travel." "No," Joshua interrupted, then caught himself. "I mean, I'd be happy to come, Mr. Ramirez. But not for money. It's not about money. Michelle's my friend." The word hung between them. Friend. When was the last time anyone had called Michelle their friend? The children at her previous school had avoided her. The kids in their neighborhood didn't play with her. Even her therapists and aides, kind as they were, related to her as a client, a patient, a case. But this teenager, this boy from a completely different world, called her his friend. Lawrence's throat tightened. Then come as her friend. Saturday afternoon. The mansion intimidated Joshua in ways the Pinnacle Club didn't. The club was a workplace, somewhere he had a defined role and purpose. But the Ramirez home in River Oaks was something else entirely. The gate alone probably cost more than his grandmother's apartment building. The circular driveway could fit 6 cars. The front door was 12 feet tall. Joshua rang the bell and waited, acutely aware of his clothes clean but cheap, his best jeans, and a polo shirt that had cost $15 at Target. He was reaching up to straighten his collar when the door opened. Michelle stood there, and her face did something Joshua had never seen before. It lit up. Her whole body expressed excitement, hands flapping, a little bounce on her toes, mouth forming words that didn't quite come out, but didn't need to. She grabbed his hand and pulled him inside. The interior was exactly what Joshua had expected, and somehow more. Art on every wall. Furniture that looked like it belonged in museums. Ceilings so high his voice echoed slightly when he said hello to Lawrence, who watched from the living room doorway with an expression Joshua couldn't quite read. But Michelle didn't give him time to be overwhelmed. She dragged him through rooms that blurred together in their expensiveness, up a curved staircase, down a hallway, and into her bedroom. The room was different from the rest of the house. Still large, still clearly expensive, but personalized in a way the other spaces weren't. And it was full of light, not just from the windows, but from dozens of crystals and prisms hanging from the ceiling, positioned on shelves, arranged on her desk. They caught the afternoon sun and threw rainbows across every surface, turning the room into a kaleidoscope. Whoa, Joshua breathed. Michelle's device spoke. Light. Patterns. Like. It's amazing, Joshua said. You did all this? Yes. That helped. Hanging. She pointed to the ceiling installations. They sat on the floor, and Michelle began arranging prisms and patterns while Joshua talked. He told her about constellations he'd learned from library books, about his grandmother who worked nights and came home exhausted but always asked about his day, about the city beyond these manicured grounds, the neighborhoods where corner stores outnumbered coffee shops, where people sat on stoops in the evening because air conditioning was a luxury. And Michelle listened, really listened, in that intense way of hers that made Joshua feel like every word mattered. Gradually, haltingly, she began responding with her device. Like stars? It asked. Yeah, I like stars. They're the same for everyone, you know? Doesn't matter if you're in River Oaks or Fifth Ward, the stars are the same. Michelle's fingers moved across the screen. Stars don't change. Stars stay. It was the longest, most complex thought Joshua had heard her express. Not just words, but philosophy. The constancy of stars in a changing world. Yeah, Joshua said softly. They do stay. That's a beautiful way to think about it. Michelle's mouth twitched into that almost smile, and she arranged another prism pattern. Downstairs, Lawrence stood in the hallway, listening to his daughter's voice robotic through the device, but hers nonetheless explaining things, asking questions, being present in a way he'd almost forgotten she could be. But the following week, the questions started. Mrs. Whitmore cornered Lawrence after a board meeting, her voice pitched low and confidential. I'm saying this as a friend, people are talking. That boy with Michelle. Who is he exactly? A young man who works here. He's been helpful with Michelle. Helpful how? Her expression was concerned, almost motherly, which made it worse. Lawrence, I know you're desperate for anything that might help her, but you need to consider the optics. Have you run a background check? Does he have credentials? Michelle is vulnerable, and he's well. She paused delicately. You know how these things look. Lawrence knew exactly what she meant. A black teenage boy spending time with a wealthy white girl. The implications she was too polite to state directly, but wanted him to hear nonetheless. Joshua has been nothing but appropriate, Lawrence said stiffly. I'm sure. But appropriate isn't enough when it comes to appearances, is it? People are concerned. Similar conversations happened throughout the week. Thompson from the finance committee asking if Lawrence had consulted with Michelle's therapists about this new development. Patterson wondering aloud if it was wise to let service staff get so personally involved. Each conversation wrapped in concern, stuffed with implications. By Friday, Lawrence's resolve had weakened. Not because he believed the insinuations he'd seen Joshua with Michelle, seen the genuine care, the patience, the respect, but because he was terrified. Terrified of being wrong. Terrified of letting hope override caution. Terrified that everyone was right, and he was being a fool. So when Joshua arrived for his usual visit on Saturday, Lawrence asked him to sit in the study first. The room was all dark wood and leather, walls lined with books Lawrence had bought but never read, a desk that cost more than Joshua's grandmother would earn in 6 months. Lawrence sat behind it, and Joshua sat across, and the dynamic was clear, executive and supplicant. "People are concerned," Lawrence said without preamble, "about your relationship with Michelle, about the appropriateness of this situation." Joshua's stomach went cold. "Sir, I would never. I know, or I think I know, but I need you to tell me, what do you want from this?" "From Michelle? From me?" It was a test. Joshua recognized it from a lifetime of tests. Prove you're not dangerous. Prove you're not after something. Prove you deserve to exist in this space. And he was tired. Tired of proving. Tired of shrinking himself. Tired of being grateful for basic human dignity. But he also recognized something in Lawrence's face. Fear. Not of Joshua, but for Michelle. The terror of a parent who'd tried everything and watched it all fail, now clinging to hope that felt too fragile to trust. So Joshua gave him truth. "You want to know what I want, Mr. Ramirez?" His voice shook slightly, but he pushed on. "I want people to see Michelle the way I do, as someone amazing, not as a problem to solve. I want her to know she's not broken. That different doesn't mean less. And yeah, maybe I also want to matter. To know that even though I'm poor and black and from the wrong neighborhood, I can still help someone. That I'm worth something beyond what the world usually sees when it looks at me." The raw honesty filled the room like smoke. Lawrence's careful executive mask cracked. "I'm not trying to take advantage of her or you," Joshua continued. "I'm not trying to get money or access or whatever people think. I just see a kid who reminds me of me, someone everyone looks at but nobody really sees. And maybe that's presumptuous. Maybe I don't have the right. But it's the truth." Silence. Then Lawrence's shoulders dropped, the tension draining out. "You are worth something," Lawrence said quietly. "And so is she. I'm sorry I questioned that. I'm sorry I let other people's fears become mine." "I understand why you did," Joshua said. "I get it. You're her father. You have to protect her. From prejudice," Lawrence said. "From people who would hurt her. Not from friendship. Not from someone who sees her." They sat in the quiet for a moment. Then Lawrence added, almost to himself, "I've spent 2 years trying to buy solutions. Hiring experts, paying for programs, throwing money at the problem. And you just showed up and cared. It's humbling. And terrifying." "Why terrifying?" "Because it means I've been approaching this all wrong. Because it means the answer wasn't something I could purchase or control." Lawrence met Joshua's eyes. "Because it means trusting someone I have no leverage over. Just trust." Joshua understood. Trust was harder than money when you were used to buying what you needed. "Michelle's upstairs waiting for you," Lawrence said. "Go. I'll deal with the board." But as Joshua climbed the stairs toward Michelle's rainbow-filled room, something felt different. Exposed. He'd let himself care deeply, let himself hope that this fragile connection could last. And he knew from experience people like him didn't get happy endings. They got punished for presuming they deserved them. Michelle was at her window, pressing buttons on her device to say Joshua. "Here. Happy." He sat beside her, and they watched clouds reform into patterns, and he tried not to think about how easily this could all be taken away. How little power he had to protect something that mattered. "Stars stay," Michelle's device said, unprompted. Joshua looked at her. "What?" She pointed up at the daylight sky where stars existed but couldn't be seen. "Stars stay. Even when can't see. Still there." It took him a moment to understand. She was telling him something about permanence, about things that endure even when invisible. "Yeah," he said, throat tight. "Stars stay." He hoped she was right. The August heat made Houston feel like a furnace with the door left open. Even inside the Pinnacle Club's aggressively air-conditioned spaces, people moved with the sluggish irritability of those trapped in summer's grip. Joshua had been working for 6 hours straight, covering the Sweet 16 party in the event space while maintaining his regular dining room duties. His feet ached, his shirt was damp with sweat under his arms, and he had 3 more hours before his shift ended. The party was exactly what he'd expected: excessive, loud, and careless. Brittany Sullivan held court in a dress that probably cost more than his grandmother's car, surrounded by friends who shrieked and laughed and spilled champagne that her parents pretended not to notice. The music thumped bass lines through the walls. Joshua cleared plates, refilled glasses, and remained invisible. Until the scream. "Someone stole my phone." Brittany's voice cut through the music, drunk and furious. "It was right on the table. Someone took it." The music stopped. Conversations died. Everyone turned. Joshua was 3 tables away, clearing dessert plates. His stomach dropped before he even understood why. Richard Sullivan appeared, Brittany's father, a man whose fortune came from real estate and whose reputation came from being tough on crime. He was red-faced, whether from anger or alcohol Joshua couldn't tell. Who was working this section? Sullivan demanded. Multiple heads turned toward Joshua. He felt the weight of their gazes, the assumptions forming before anyone spoke. Check him, Sullivan ordered security. Check his pockets. The staff area. He was the last one near our table. Mr. Sullivan, Marcus appeared from nowhere, his voice carefully controlled. I'm sure there's been a misunderstanding. We can review the security footage. Are you refusing to cooperate with finding stolen property? Sullivan stepped into Marcus's space. Maybe we need to check your area too. Maybe there's a culture problem with your staff. The threat was clear and familiar. Step out of line, and we'll make it worse for everyone who looks like you. Marcus stepped back. Of course, sir. Whatever you need. Security 2 men Joshua had nodded to every shift, who'd always seemed friendly enough approached him with expressions that had gone professional and distant. Come with us, please. Joshua's hands shook as he set down the plates. Every eye in the room watched him. He could feel their assumptions, their certainty. The black teenager in the cheap uniform had obviously stolen from the rich white girl. The story wrote itself. They took him to a back office he'd never seen before, windowless, fluorescent lit, with a desk and 3 chairs. They didn't find the phone in his pockets, but that didn't seem to matter. We need you to wait here while we investigate, the older security guard said, not unkindly, but not warmly either. Can I call my grandmother? She's expecting me home. Your phone is in your locker. We can't let you access it right now. Then can you call her? She'll worry. Just sit tight. The door closed. Not locked, but he knew better than to try to leave. Joshua sat and tried to control his breathing. 2 hours passed with the kind of slowness that made every minute feel stretched and distorted. He knew the script. He'd watched it play out with his father, who'd spent 18 months in jail for a robbery he didn't commit before the charges were dismissed 18 months too late to save his job, his apartment, his life. He'd seen it with his cousins, with boys from his neighborhood, with every black man who'd ever existed in spaces where they could be blamed because blaming them was easier than admitting uncertainty. Guilty until proven innocent, and sometimes not even then. In the main dining room, Michelle sat with her father, working through her dinner with careful attention to color organization. Then she looked up and saw Joshua. Or rather, saw security escorting Joshua through the hallway visible from their table. Her whole body went rigid. The fork dropped from her hand. Michelle? Lawrence looked up from his phone. What's wrong? She was staring at the now empty hallway, hands beginning to flap in distress. Then she stood, tried to follow, but Lawrence caught her arm. Michelle, sweetie, not now. We're eating. She started hitting herself. Fists against her thighs, her arms, quick sharp strikes that Lawrence had learned meant overwhelming distress. Hey, stop. Michelle, stop. He grabbed her hands gently. What's wrong? Tell me what's wrong. She grabbed her device with shaking fingers, pressing buttons frantically. Friend. Joshua. Wrong. Help. Help. It was the most complex expression of emotion she'd ever communicated. Not just words but feeling, urgency, a plea for action. Lawrence felt ice in his chest. What happened to Joshua? Michelle kept pressing. Wrong. Help. Wrong. Friend. Help. Lawrence flagged down a server. Where's Joshua? The young man who usually works this section? The server's eyes went wide. Oh, there was an incident. With the Sullivan party. He's in the back office with security. Lawrence was on his feet before the man finished speaking. He found Marcus in the staff corridor, the older man's face drawn with exhaustion and defeat. What's happening with Joshua? Marcus met his eyes. Brittany Sullivan says he stole her phone. Mr. Sullivan wants him arrested. The board is meeting in 15 minutes to terminate his employment. Did they find the phone on him? No, but that doesn't seem to matter. This was the moment. Lawrence could stay out of it, protect his position, maintain his relationships with Sullivan and the board. It was someone else's problem, someone else's fight. The boy would land on his feet somewhere else, and Michelle would eventually adjust to his absence, and life would continue. He thought of Michelle's tears, of Joshua's quiet dignity, of every time he'd looked the other way when something was unjust but inconvenient to address. Give me the security footage, Lawrence said. All of it. Every camera angle from the last 3 hours. Sir? Now, Marcus. And tell the board I'll be joining their meeting. Lawrence walked into that emergency board meeting with his laptop under his arm. 8 members sat around the table, most looking irritated at being pulled from their evenings. Sullivan sat at the head, still red-faced, arms crossed. Lawrence. Good. We're about to vote on terminating the boy's employment. Given the circumstances. What circumstances? Lawrence set up his laptop, connecting it to the room's display screen. That a teenage girl who's been drinking champagne misplaced her phone and immediately blamed the nearest black employee? Mrs. Whitmore shifted uncomfortably. No one's blaming anyone based on. Then what are you basing it on? Lawrence pulled up the footage. Because I have security video here. Let's watch it together. He played the footage from the event space. It showed clearly Joshua working 3 sections away from the Sullivan table when Brittany claimed her phone was stolen. Never approaching it, never touching anything that wasn't his job to clear. So before we destroy this young man's reputation and livelihood, perhaps we should acknowledge that he didn't steal anything. Sullivan's face darkened. Well, someone took it. The staff has access. Actually, Lawrence interrupted, pulling up another video file. Your daughter left it in the women's bathroom. Security found it 20 minutes ago. But you didn't tell them to stop the investigation, did you, Richard? Because you'd already decided Joshua was guilty. The room went silent. Lawrence's voice shook with suppressed rage. For 2 years, I've paid specialists hundreds of thousands of dollars to help my daughter. Experts with credentials that fill entire walls. None of them reached her. This 15-year-old boy who you just detained and humiliated? He saw her. He helped her find her voice when no one else could. And the moment something went wrong, you assumed he was a thief because of how he looks. Lawrence, Mrs. Whitmore started, her voice placating, we have to protect our members. Protect them from what? Lawrence's hands were shaking now. From someone who's done nothing but show kindness and extraordinary skill? Or protect your comfort from having to see your own prejudices? This is about liability, Thompson tried. This is about racism. Lawrence said it clearly, letting the word fill the room. Let's call it what it is. A black teenager gets accused, and we assume guilt. We detain him, humiliate him, prepare to fire him without evidence. Would we have done that if he was white? Would we have done that to Richard's son? How dare you? Sullivan stood. The door opened. Michelle walked in. The room froze. Michelle Ramirez, who never spoke, who avoided crowds, who melted down in overwhelming situations, stood in the doorway. Mrs. Chun appeared behind her, reaching to guide her back, but Michelle shook her off. She walked to the center of the room, her gait unsteady but determined. Every board member stared. Lawrence started to speak, but something in his daughter's expression stopped him. Michelle opened her mouth. The words came haltingly, painfully, each one an obvious effort. Joshua is my friend. The room erupted in murmurs. Michelle's hands flapped, but she didn't stop. Don't hurt him. He stays. Her voice was clearer now, gaining strength. She looked at each board member, then at her father. You were wrong. You didn't see. She paused, gathering breath. Joshua sees. Then she turned and walked out, leaving a room full of wealthy, powerful adults completely silent. Lawrence found his voice first. Meeting adjourned. Joshua will be reinstated with full back pay and a formal apology from this board. Anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me directly. They found Joshua in the back office, head in his hands, shoulders curved inward in a posture of defeat that broke Lawrence's heart. When the door opened, Joshua looked up with the expression of someone expecting another blow, eyes wary, body tense to absorb impact. Instead, Lawrence said, I'm sorry. You were right, and we were wrong. Joshua stared, uncomprehending. My daughter wants me to tell you stay. Lawrence's voice caught. And so do I. You stay, Joshua. For as long as you want to be here. Marcus appeared in the doorway. The board voted. Unanimous reinstatement. Mr. Sullivan is being asked to issue a formal apology. Joshua's face crumpled. Not with relief, with the delayed shock of trauma. The release of tension he'd held for 2 hours while sitting in that room waiting for his life to be decided by people who'd already judged him. I didn't take anything, he said, and his voice was small, young, 15 years old. I wouldn't. I know, Lawrence said. We know. And I'm sorry you had to prove that. I'm sorry we didn't believe you first. They sat in that back office for another 20 minutes while Joshua pulled himself back together. Michelle appeared, slipping past the adults to sit beside him on the floor. She didn't say anything, just pressed her shoulder against his, solid and present. "You spoke," Joshua said finally. "In front of all those people." Michelle's device was in her hands. She typed "friend needed help." Had to be loud. Joshua laughed, watery but real. "You were loud. You were amazing." She typed again "you stay." Stars stay. Same thing. Lawrence watched his daughter and this remarkable boy sitting on the floor of a back office, and he understood something fundamental. Michelle hadn't just been helped by Joshua. She'd been seen, and being seen had given her the strength to speak, to fight, to show up for someone else the way he'd shown up for her. That was worth more than every degree and credential he'd ever paid for. That was everything. The formal apology from the Sullivan family arrived on Pinnacle Club letterhead, typed and bloodless. Joshua read it once and filed it away in a drawer he'd probably never open again. The board's reinstatement came with full back pay and what Mrs. Whitmore called "our sincere regrets for the misunderstanding." But the real change happened 3 days later, when Lawrence invited Joshua and his grandmother to his office at Ramirez Technologies. Their apartment had never been in a building like this: 42 floors of glass and steel, elevators that moved so smoothly you barely felt them, reception areas with art that probably cost more than her apartment. She wore her Sunday dress and kept her purse clutched tight, her eyes taking in everything with the wariness of someone who'd learned that spaces like this weren't built for people like her. Lawrence's office was all windows and clean lines. He'd had chairs brought in, arranged in a circle rather than across his intimidating desk. Coffee service sat on the table, untouched. "Thank you for coming," Lawrence said, and he looked nervous in a way Joshua had never seen. "I wanted to talk to you both about Michelle." And Joshua. Vera's expression didn't change, but Joshua felt her go still beside him. "Michelle needs Joshua in her life," Lawrence continued. "That's become clear. But I don't want this to be about employment in the traditional sense, or about charity. I'd like to establish a formal arrangement where Joshua works with Michelle as a companion, a mentor. We'll structure it as a position with genuine compensation, benefits, and support for his education." He looked directly at Vera. "I'm asking this as one parent to another, not as an employer. As someone who wants the best for his child and recognizes that Joshua has given her something I couldn't buy with all my money." Vera was silent for a long moment. Then she spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "My grandson is not a project, Mr. Ramirez." "I know," Lawrence said immediately. "He's a person of remarkable gifts who deserves opportunity. I'm offering this because it's right, and because Michelle deserves to keep her friend in her life. Because Joshua deserves support for what he's already given freely." Joshua looked between them, his grandmother, who'd raised him on night shifts and sacrifice, and this billionaire who'd learned to see past his own privilege. Two parents, two completely different worlds, both trying to do right by the children in their care. "I'll do it," Joshua said. "For Michelle. Not because you're paying me, I'd do it anyway, but because I want to." Vera's hand found his, squeezed hard. "Then we do this right. Contract in writing. Fair compensation. And my grandson keeps his dignity and his choices." "Agreed," Lawrence said. "On all counts." Over the following months, Michelle continued to speak more. Not fluently, words still came with effort, and some days the device was easier than her voice. But genuinely, authentically. She started at a new school in September, one Lawrence had found after weeks of research and Joshua's input. It was smaller, designed for neurodivergent kids, focused on honoring different ways of experiencing the world rather than forcing conformity to neurotypical standards. She made friends. Real friends, not just classmates who tolerated her. Kids who understood when she needed to stim, who didn't mind when she used her device instead of speaking, who appreciated her observations about light and patterns and the mathematical beauty of everyday things. She wrote in a journal now mostly about stars and fractals, but also about Joshua, who taught her that being different doesn't mean being broken. Her teachers showed Lawrence entries that made his throat tight. "I used to think I was wrong. Now I think I'm just different. Different is good. Different can be beautiful." Joshua visited twice a week, sometimes more. Sometimes they talked, when Michelle felt verbal and the words came easily. Sometimes they sat in comfortable silence in her rainbow room, arranging prisms and watching light break into its component colors. Sometimes they used the AAC device to discuss complex ideas that Michelle couldn't yet verbalize, but could express through images and symbols. But always, they saw each other. Really saw each other, in that fundamental way that makes people feel less alone in the world. With the mentorship position's income and Lawrence's support, Joshua enrolled in dual-credit courses at Houston Community College. He discovered a gift for psychology and education, a passion for understanding how people think and learn and communicate. He wanted to work with kids, especially kids whom systems had written off as too difficult, too different, too much trouble to understand. But more than academics, he found his own voice. When the Pinnacle Club hosted a community diversity event organized partly in response to the Sullivan incident, Lawrence asked Joshua if he'd be willing to speak. Joshua stood at a podium in front of people who'd looked through him for months, and he talked about unconscious bias, about the gift society misses when it devalues people based on their circumstances or the color of their skin, about how Michelle had taught him that different languages of communication are still languages, still valid, still worthy of being heard. Some members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some wiped their eyes. All of them listened. Afterward, Marcus approached him. The older man's expression was complicated pride mixed with something that looked like regret. "I was wrong," Marcus said. "I told you to stay in your lane. But maybe the problem isn't you leaving your lane, it's that the lanes shouldn't exist in the first place." Joshua didn't know what to say to that, so he just gripped Marcus's offered hand. Lawrence launched a foundation in October, the Ramirez Opportunity Initiative, dedicated to creating mentorship pathways for kids from underserved communities. Not charity, he was careful to explain in the press release Joshua helped him write, but access and opportunity. An acknowledgement that brilliance exists in places privilege has overlooked, and the world is poorer for not seeking it out. But the deeper transformation happened at home. Lawrence stepped back from Ramirez Technologies, promoting his COO and reducing his own hours to part-time advisory. He spent more time with Michelle, and Joshua had taught him something profound. His daughter didn't need him to fix her or buy solutions. She needed him to see her, to enter her world instead of demanding she enter his. Their relationship deepened. Michelle spoke more with him now, especially in the quiet evenings when they sat on the terrace and watched stars appear over Houston's light-polluted sky. One night in November, she asked him, "Why did everyone give up on me?" Lawrence's heart broke. He set down his coffee, trying to find words adequate to the question. "Because we were looking at you wrong," he said finally. "We thought we needed to change you, to make you fit into our idea of normal." Joshua knew better. He just needed to understand you, to learn your language instead of insisting you learn ours. Michelle considered this, her hands moving through one of her comfortable stim patterns. "Joshua is wise." "Yes," Lawrence agreed. "He is." The following summer, on a June evening when the heat had finally broken into something almost pleasant, the Ramirez family hosted a small gathering. Not at the club Lawrence had quietly ended their membership months ago, but at their home. It was intimate. Joshua and Vera, who'd become a fixture in their lives. Mrs. Chun, who'd stayed on not as an aide, but as a genuine friend to Michelle. Marcus, who'd become an unlikely mentor to Joshua and a surprising advocate for change at the Pinnacle. 3 of Michelle's classmates from her new school, kids who communicated in a mix of words and devices and sign language. Michelle had asked to speak. She'd prepared something on her device, but she wanted to try saying it aloud. Joshua sat nearby, ready to support if she needed him, but confident she wouldn't. She stood at the head of the table, her hands flapping in that pattern everyone now recognized as excitement. She took a breath. 1 year ago, Michelle began, her voice steady. "I was silent. People thought I had nothing to say. But I had everything to say. I just couldn't make the words come." She looked at Joshua, and her expression was pure affection. "You didn't try to fix me. You just listened. You saw me when I was invisible. And you taught my dad to see me too." Her hands flapped harder, joy expressed through movement. No one told her to stop. Everyone understood. "You taught me I'm not broken. I'm just different. And different is good. Different can be beautiful." She reached for her device and pressed a button. The screen displayed an image she'd created: 2 figures, one tall and dark, one small and light, standing under a sky full of stars rendered in her characteristic precise patterns. "You're my best friend," Michelle said, and her voice caught but held. "You didn't give up. So I won't either." The room erupted in applause. Michelle sat down quickly, overwhelmed by the attention but smiling. One of her classmates signed something that made her laugh. Later, after dinner and cake and the slow drift of guests saying goodnight, Joshua and Lawrence stood on the terrace. Inside, Michelle played a game with her friends, her laughter ringing out clear and joyful and free. You know what the hardest part of all this has been? Lawrence asked, staring out at the Houston skyline. Joshua shook his head, realizing how many people I've walked past my entire life without really seeing. How many Joshuas and Michelles the world dismisses every day. Lawrence turned to him. You changed my daughter's life, but you also changed mine. Joshua considered this, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. Then, my grandmother says everyone we meet is fighting a battle we know nothing about. Maybe the trick is just paying attention. Seeing people. All people. Maybe, Lawrence agreed. Michelle told me you're wise. She's right. Joshua laughed. I'm just a kid from Fifth Ward who saw a little girl tearing napkins into constellations and recognized something. What did you recognize? Joshua thought about it. About being overlooked. About being invisible. About the loneliness of living in a world that looks right through you. About a little girl in a lavender dress who existed in a language nobody else had bothered to learn. Someone like me, he said finally. Someone who just needed to be seen. They stood in comfortable silence as the Texas stars emerged overhead, distant points of light in the darkness, each one burning with its own fire, none of them alone. The sky was the same here in River Oaks as it was in Fifth Ward. The same constellations, the same infinite depth, the same reminder that some things transcend the boundaries humans draw. Inside, Michelle's voice rose in explanation of something to her friends. Joshua couldn't hear the words, but he heard the confidence in her tone, the ease of someone comfortable in her own skin. Stars stay, Joshua said softly, remembering. What? Lawrence asked. Something Michelle told me once. That stars stay, even when you can't see them. They're still there. Lawrence smiled. She's right about that too. A year ago, Joshua had been invisible, Michelle had been silent, and Lawrence had been so busy trying to buy solutions that he'd missed the one his daughter actually needed. Now Michelle had found her voices, plural, because she'd learned she could speak in whatever way felt right. Now Joshua was heading to UT Austin with a full scholarship and a future that felt vast with possibility. Now Lawrence understood that the best things in life couldn't be purchased, only recognized and honored. The stars wheeled overhead, ancient and constant, watching over a city full of people, some seen, some overlooked, all of them fighting battles nobody else fully understood. But on this terrace, in this moment, 3 people stood in the knowledge that they'd seen each other truly. And in that seeing, all of them had been transformed. Michelle appeared at the door, backlit by the warm light from inside. Joshua, come look at something. He turned, smiling. What is it? Stars. Different kind. Come see. She led him inside to her laptop, where she'd pulled up images of distant galaxies, each one a spiral of light and darkness, each one different, each one beautiful. Lawrence followed them, and for once he wasn't trying to direct or fix or purchase anything. He was just there, present, watching his daughter share her wonder with her friend. Outside, the first stars of evening burned steady and true, eternal witnesses to the small miracles happening beneath them, 2 people seeing each other, and in that seeing, discovering they were never truly invisible at all, just waiting for someone to look. The greatest gift we can give another person is to see them, truly see them for exactly who they are. Not who we think they should be, not what we want them to become, but the truth of their being in this moment. In that seeing, both the seen and the seer are transformed. To all my amazing viewers, thank you. Every time you watch, like, and share my videos, you keep the echoes of love alive. Your support, your comments, and your time mean more than you know. This channel exists because of you. I appreciate you deeply.